Africa is a continent with a long history of countries full of dominion and conflict, but it's especially had a problem with dictators. Whether it was by colonizers, chiefs, or power-hungry military men, the continent has had a long history of powerful strongmen ruling their countries. Even after the age of military dictators in Africa had passed, corrupt republics quickly took their place. Political elites used their power to enrich and better their own interests rather than their own country. Most countries in Africa were unfortunately not spared this fate, but one nation was able to go on a different path. The Republic of Botswana is one of the few countries in Africa, if not the only one, to have vastly improved since becoming independent. Transparency International has consistently rated Botswana as the highest in Africa for non-corrupt practices and good democratic institutions who uphold the rule of law. It has also been able to become one of the few African countries with a high GDP per capita and has spent most of its history with the highest growth rate in the continent, which is incredibly ironic since Botswana started out as the poorest country on the continent and had very little infrastructure with only 12 kilometers of paved road. The discovery of natural resources like diamonds gave Botswana the opportunity to put them on this path of success though, but that's only part of the story. Countries like Sierra Leone and Nigeria had natural resources, but corruption by elites and conflict between them squandered their potential. Botswana's unique ability to maintain a fair democracy and good governance helped them set themselves apart and use their resources for the betterment of their country. But why did Botswana develop such strong democratic institutions that have caused their country to stick to good governance and not fall into the trap of corruption? One can argue that there are many factors that play into this. Botswana's pre-colonial history and culture, the lack of colonial impact on its culture, its homogeneity, and good leadership have all played into the success of Botswana's democracy. Botswana is a country dominated by a group called the Botswana, who are a Bantu people that speak the Swana language. In the 18th century, they migrated into the land that would become Botswana from South Africa and happen to be closely related to the Basotho people in Lesotho. Like most in Africa, the Botswana are not a completely united ethnic group. There are many different tribes that separate them despite the fact that they speak the same language. Separations between tribes have been a source of conflict on the continent since independence, but luckily the Botswana were able to avoid such divisions. Through common language, culture, and enemy, the Botswana were able to prevent the ethnic conflict that was common throughout the continent. Despite the different tribes, most people in Botswana speak the same language. In fact, as high as 85% of the country speaks the language. Also, while each tribe was run by different chiefs, they all had similar cultures and institutions. One of which was the Gotla, which are public assemblies held in Botswana towns and were places where adult males were allowed to advise or even criticize the chief. This ingrained in Botswana culture ideas of compromise, accountability, and democracy. In fact, the Gotla are considered to be one of the oldest forms of democracy in the world. Lastly, Botswana tribes throughout the land shared common purpose during the various times in their history, such as in the 19th century when migrant tribes fleeing from Shaka Zulu's empire arrived to take Botswana land, or when the Boers attacked during their attempts to find new places to settle. The Botswana tribes found a common enemy during this time through their desire to expel these enemies from their land. This would create a common unity and set them on the path to shared identity and purpose. It wouldn't be too long after when the state of Botswana finally came into being. Prior to colonization, chiefs of the nation would constantly appeal to the British government to come into their land and ask to be made into a protectorate. The Botswana were terrified of the Boers in South Africa coming to take them over, so they constantly tried to get British protection, but the empire had no interest in administrating a land they considered worthless. At that time, no one knew Botswana was rich in resources, so the idea of making it a colony was more trouble than it was worth. The situation would change when Germany managed to claim territory in the southwest, which spurred British fears of other colonial powers getting into the African interior. So the British made Botswana a protectorate, but left much of the government affairs to the chiefs because they had little desire to invest in a nation they saw as worthless. The British had originally intended to give Botswana to South Africa, but thanks to the united front against the idea by the three major Botswana chiefs, the concept was delayed and eventually abandoned altogether. This meant that Botswana was relatively untouched throughout its colonial history, so many parts of their institutions and culture managed to stay intact. A major reason why Botswana chiefs were able to unite and oppose being a South African territory was because colonizers made little effort to divide the populace and destabilize them. The limited impact of colonialism had its problems though. The country was one of the poorest in the continent. It was hardly developed. By the time independence rolled around, the British had little expectations for their former protectorate. The country was heavily reliant on foreign aid and had less than 12 kilometers of paved road. Botswana was the last country to have potential in the eyes of many. The country was transitioned into independence after early attempts at self-governance. Botswana's most powerful political party came into power around this time. It was called the Botswana Democratic Party. The previous parties all had slim voter bases like urban groups and workers who were small parts of the country. The BDP's leader, Surrette C, was able to build a strong coalition of educated elites and traditional chiefs to propel him into power. Surrette C was originally the heir to one of Botswana's most powerful chieftainships, but pressure on Botswana from South Africa about his marriage to a white English woman named Ruth Williams caused him to go into exile. He eventually gave up his claim for the title and returned to the country to enter politics. After independence, Surrette C quickly went to work. He made efforts to prevent tribal conflicts by weakening the power of chiefs and making their branch in government called the House of Chiefs strictly an advisory role. Then, after the discovery of diamonds within the country, he quickly implemented central government supremacy so that the resources would be fairly distributed. This surprised many because most diamonds were found within his tribe's territory, and if he wanted to ensure their own prosperity, he would have let them keep the resources for themselves. This was smart planning on his part and would be the first step in preventing ethnic conflict over the resources. Botswana's government was also very unique because many of the individuals in government were committed to preventing corruption and ensuring good governance. Most were agricultural elites, so they used the government to make the agricultural sector better for their investments. This meant that the government implemented good policies, and by the time the diamonds were discovered, they didn't want to ruin the good fortune they already had. Conflicts over resources or corrupt government practices would have hurt the economic investments that many elites in power had. So Surrette C decided to use the diamond revenue wisely. He entered a joint venture with a South African corporation and created the company De Beers, where they would get 50% of the revenue made. This, combined with the smart agricultural policies employed by the government, led the country to have some of the highest GDP growth in the whole world. Kama invested their money in development, infrastructure, and social services, while also putting aside money for when diamond revenues were low. This smart planning led the country into a fair amount of prosperity. Botswana was able to become so prosperous because of its ability to ensure good governance rather than having their political elites employ corrupt practices. Botswana's fairly homogeneous population meant that the country had an easier time working together and sharing power rather than fighting over it. Botswana also had a long history of democracy thanks to the Gatla, which was still used in its post-colonial institutions. Members of Botswana's parliament often hold a Gatla where they consult citizens about policies and government. This ensures that the government would be held accountable to the will of the people. The limited impact of colonialism also ensured that these pre-colonial institutions would stay in use and not be torn down by colonizers seeking to disrupt political stability. Overall, there are many factors that have led to Botswana's prosperity, but these seem to be some of the major reasons. Thanks to its pure luck in the colonial lottery, the country has the freest democracy in Africa. It's not perfect. There seems to be one-party rule within the country because the BDP has been in power with no strong opposition since independence. That being said though, there is no evidence of electoral fraud, and the party has been responsive to the will of the people by changing their platform in order to keep getting elected. Most African countries simply performed a coup when they feared losing power, but the BDP chose to pursue the democratic option. There are signs of this wealth and free democracy being threatened though. Corruption and one-party rule within the country is still a very real fear. The country is one of the most economically unequal in the world, despite their vast diamond wealth, and unemployment is still very high. It's also been accused of authoritarian tendencies towards minority groups like the San people. There is hope for the country though. They've committed to democracy for as long as they've been a country, and if they hold themselves to it, they'll be able to persevere and remain one of the beacons of freedom and democracy within Africa.